He set out at first light, driving as far as the forestry road would take him. Beyond that, he walked. Snow covered the ground in an even layer, untouched but for his steps. The San Juans rose ahead, dark against a sky just beginning to turn gold. The cold was sharp, and the morning was still. Out here, the world made sense again. Alone in the mountains, he felt that old, familiar thrill rise in his chest. The pines stretched tall around him, weighed down by drifts of snow that glittered whenever the rising sun threaded between their branches. A faint breeze stirred, sending tiny avalanches of powder cascading onto the ground. He paused now and then to enjoy the quiet. No cars, no voices, just his own breath pluming in the morning air. At times, the only sound was the faint creaking of trunks weighed down by snow. It felt peaceful, a calm domain unspoiled by hurry or crowds. He made good time, weaving between trees along a path faintly etched by animals. It struck him how pure the light was, almost liquid in quality, refracted through floating motes of frost. Stopping to sip from his flask, he admired the slope below, a gentle white expanse dotted with spruces. He was rarely this high in winter, but the isolation called to him more powerfully than ever. The forest had a serene majesty to it, as though it tolerated him only because he moved gently, leaving little trace. A sudden crack echoed through the pines, distant yet resonant enough to command his attention. He froze. It sounded like a falling tree. Not surprising in deep winter, ice could shear a trunk or pull down a limb until it gave way entirely. Still, it seemed a shame that anything should break on such a beautiful day. When the forest settled again, he moved on without hurry. He glimpsed wildlife in passing. A startled hare, bounding away to vanish among low branches. A pair of ravens circling overhead, their caws swallowed by the cold air. Even in the stillness, there were signs the forest was ticking along. The quiet was deep, but it wasn't empty. By late morning, the sun rose higher, painting the snow in soft, dazzling white. He found an outcropping of rock, where the slope dipped steeply, from which he could see the valley spread out below, vast and white, edged with shadow. He steadied his rifle, thinking he might spot deer or elk in the clearing. Before he could choose a vantage, he heard more snapping in the distance, rapid, spaced in odd intervals. Possibly another tree succumbing to ice, though there was a strange rhythm to it. He stood listening, wondering if an old trunk was coming down piece by piece. The air felt colder suddenly, but not in a way that bit his skin. With a small shake of his head, he turned his attention back to the possibility of game. He skirted a stand of spruce, careful to keep his steps light and slow. Any sign of a buck, and he wanted to be ready. The land dipped again, and in the gentle hollow he spotted movement, a shape moving from behind a cluster of firs. He raised the rifle to eye level, and his pulse quickened. A single deer appeared, stepping across the snow with measured care. At first, he noticed only the grace of its movement. Its coat looked ashen in the half-shade, and puffs of breath escaped its muzzle in short bursts. He aligned his sights and paused, waiting for the perfect shot. The deer paused too, ears flicking. It should have bolted the moment it sensed him. Instead, it stood motionless, almost as though it had chosen to present itself. He settled his finger along the trigger, feeling the tension of the hunt fill his chest. Yet something made him hesitate. The deer wasn't looking away. It was peering right at him, body still, gaze unwavering. As seconds slid by, he began to feel the shot would be too easy. He'd taken many in his life, but there was a sudden pang in his gut, like crossing an unseen boundary he had no right to cross. The quiet of the forest pressed in, and still the deer stared. He lowered the rifle an inch, confounded. "What are you doing?" he muttered, half to himself, half to the creature. It tilted its head as though considering him. Then it spoke. "I'm hiding." The words were soft, carried clearly in the cold air. His heart lurched. Shock washed over him so thoroughly that he forgot how to speak. A deer had no right to form human words. He blinked, certain he was hearing things. "From me?" he managed. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. The deer did not shift its stance or gaze. Snow drifted around its hooves. "No," it said. He'd never felt so pinned, as though hunted himself by that unblinking stare. A surge of disbelief clamored in his head. This was impossible, a trick of the wind, some echo in his mind. Before he could question further, the deer half turned and darted into the cover of the trees. It vanished so quickly, he almost believed it had never been there. He remained where he stood, rifle heavy in his hands, a slow swirl of snow resettling onto the lower branches. His breath came in sharp bursts, rising in the frigid air. Part of him wanted to call out, but he wasn't even sure what to say. The mind reeled, an internal voice urging him to chase the creature and demand answers. Another voice insisted that none of this was real, that exhaustion or altitude must be playing games with him. Before he could move, a low groan rippled behind him. The sound of wood shifting, perhaps, or something else stirring beneath the snow-laden canopy. He swung round, staring at the dark pine trunks. The silence that followed felt deeper than any he'd known in these woods. The cold stung his cheeks, and the quiet pressed in until it felt like pressure in his ears. He swallowed and stepped backward, half expecting the deer to reappear. The forest remained still. It crossed his mind to retreat to his truck, drive away, and forget he'd ever witnessed such a thing. But the strangeness of it made him linger, as though some unspoken tether held him in place. Slowly, he exhaled and shouldered his rifle. Then he moved downhill, following the deer tracks in the snow, trying to see if they led anywhere or simply vanished altogether. His heart drummed wildly. The words floated in his memory. "I'm hiding." Hiding from what? The question looped through his mind as he picked his way among the trees. Light danced through the branches, the day still bright and beautiful. Yet he no longer felt the comfort of nature at peace. Something in these woods had changed. Or perhaps something within him had changed, and he couldn't pretend otherwise. He pressed on, each step crunching in the snow. A single crow flew overhead, as though surveying him. He noticed how its call seemed lost in the wind. For now, all he could do was continue. He followed the tracks downhill, each print crisp in the snow where the deer had trotted away. The initial burst of adrenaline still hummed in his veins, but curiosity had won out over caution. The terrain here grew more uneven, draped in shifting beams of sunlight that barely penetrated the dense canopy. Every so often, he paused to scan the branches or peered deeper into the trees, half expecting to glimpse that impossible creature again. Despite himself, he kept recalling the quiet, unearthly tone of its voice. A deer speaking like a person, it made no sense. He'd sooner believe he was hallucinating from the thin mountain air. Yet the tracks were real, and so was the faint trembling in his chest each time he pictured its gaze. One step at a time, he pressed on, letting his boots sink into the powder, determined to find some rational explanation. He walked for another 15 minutes or so, the forest growing thicker around him. Light from the midday sun cast a patchwork of bright spots across the ground, but there were stretches of deep shade where snow looked almost blue. The quiet settled in again, and for a time he heard nothing but the crunch of his boots and the persistent murmur of a slight breeze. His breath came steadily, and the cold air no longer burned his lungs the way it had that morning. Then a noise behind him, distant at first but unmistakable, broke the hush. It sounded like a tree snapping. He stiffened, pausing mid-step. After a moment, a second crack echoed through the woods. Something was definitely moving back there. Not the subtle scurry of a fox or the snapping of a twig under a small hoof, but a deep, violent crack that suggested large timber giving way. He stared back in the direction he had come, trying to make sense of it. Though the forest looked no different, he felt a sudden tension in the air. His heartbeat quickened. A single crash might have passed without thought. But this, one after another, was harder to ignore. With a jolt of clarity, he realized he had no intention of finding out what was making that sound. All at once, the deer tracks he'd been following seemed like a fool's errand. The memory of those two words, "I'm hiding," rose in his mind. Hiding from what? Perhaps the answer now snapped branches behind him. "Don't be ridiculous," he cautioned himself, but the words seemed hollow. He glanced deeper into the pines where the tracks led, then at the slope he'd followed down. Feeling exposed, he gripped his rifle and made a decision. Time to leave. He turned around, squinting through the glare. He tried to fix his position by the slope of the land. He knew the truck lay somewhere beyond the last ridge, so he began a wide arc around the source of the crashing, hoping to keep it at a distance. With each step, though, he found himself veering off, forced by steep inclines or thickets of pines, to adjust his course until he could barely tell if he was heading nearer or farther from his goal. Another splintering crack echoed through the forest, the reverberation prickling along his spine. He pressed on, hugging the contour of a shallow rise, seeking a more open stretch where he could regain his bearings. Yet the trees grew tighter, and the land funneled him in unexpected ways, bending his path into a loop he hadn't intended. The ground rose in small ridges, each crowned by trees drooping under the weight of heavy snowfall. At times, the snow came up almost to his knees, slowing him down. He tried to keep the sun on his left shoulder to maintain a steady heading, but the slope of the terrain kept nudging him off course. Before long, he found himself gazing at unfamiliar stands of spruce. He stopped to catch his breath, scanning the woods for any landmark, a boulder, a cluster of aspens, to tie his bearings to. Every direction appeared the same, a spread of white and green, branches bending under thick drifts. The sky overhead was bright, the sun nearing its zenith, mocking his sense of time. "Calm down," he told himself. "You're not lost, you just need to think." The trouble was, thinking demanded quiet, and the intermittent crashes behind him refused to grant that. Each resounding thud jolted his nerves, crowding out rational thought. Now and then, the forest fell silent, letting his heart rate settle. Then another snap would ring out, and he'd feel the surge in his chest all over again. Gritting his teeth, he chose a direction with the gentlest slope, hoping it would lead him downhill. Lower ground usually provided a path or creek he could follow out. With the rifle slung across his front, he trudged forward, stepping over fallen branches and under bent boughs. Every so often, he'd pause to listen. In those moments, the silence thickened, almost a physical force. No bird calls, no wind, just his own heavy breathing, harsh in the cold. As he worked his way around a ridge, he spotted fresh tracks that were neither his nor the deer's, long swathes in the snow, as though a large trunk had been dragged or shoved aside. Broken limbs lay scattered, some still bristling with pine needles. It was as if something had bulldozed its way through the forest, oblivious to obstacles. The depth of the furrows made his mouth go dry. Moose can push through snow, but not like this. Bears are denning. Elk don't do that to trees. It didn't add up. Nothing he knew moved through the forest like that. The longer he looked, the less sense it made. He forced himself to keep going. The silence had weight to it now, as if something had stepped into the space just out of view. He resisted the urge to call out, for fear that whatever was causing the crashes might answer. The sun's glare off the snow made his eyes ache. In his peripheral vision, every dark shape became a potential threat. Another crack reverberated, setting his teeth on edge. Time blurred as he tried to maintain a steady pace. The shadows shifted around him. The sun seemed to accelerate across the sky. He noticed sweat on his brow despite the chill, and his throat felt parched. After one more crest through thick pines, he paused to rest against a trunk. His lungs burned with each breath. He peered back the way he'd come, but the forest wove itself into an impenetrable screen. Anxiety tightened his chest. He couldn't ignore the sense that he was being driven in circles, that the noise behind him was part of some chase he didn't fully understand. It reminded him of the deer's calm statement, "I'm hiding." A bizarre notion slithered into his mind, that perhaps the deer had led him here, deeper into the wild, leaving him at the mercy of whatever roamed these woods. But that made no sense. Deer did not speak, and they certainly didn't set traps. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaling a shaky breath. "Don't give in to panic," he told himself. "Find a vantage point, find your bearings, keep your head." But the scattered roaring of splitting wood returned, closer than ever. He glanced at the rifle in his hands, no longer sure it would be any use at all. With the sound of another crash, he pushed off from the trunk and carried on, hating the sense of being herded. If only he could break free into open ground. If only he could see more than a few yards ahead or behind. The tension pressed in on him from all sides, the bright afternoon now a mockery of the calm morning he'd so enjoyed. Yet he kept moving, forcing one foot in front of the other, determined to shake the feeling of pursuit. As he wove between the snow-laden pines, a new realization crept in. Whatever it wasn't losing interest. He first noticed how low the sun had dipped when the patches of light on the snow began to turn golden again, weaving long shadows through the trees. His coat was damp at the collar, sweat accumulating despite the chill. He couldn't remember how many times he'd heard that splintering crash echo behind him now. Sometimes it rumbled distantly. Other times it seemed just beyond the nearest pines. Each crack sent a pulse of alarm that kept him moving, even as fatigue gnawed at his muscles. The ground underfoot only ever became more erratic, with hidden hollows and broken branches half buried in fresh powder. Keeping track of direction felt impossible. The sun was no longer an easy guide. Its rays fell at odd angles, gilding tree trunks and lighting pockets of snow before leaving entire swathes of forest in gloom. Occasionally, he saw the silhouettes of passing birds overhead, but they never lingered. He felt more and more alone, trapped in a world of white and grey with only the promise of approaching darkness. He forced himself to slow, if only to get his bearings. The hush in the forest was immense. Gone was any trace of the breeze, and without the sound of wildlife, his own heartbeat seemed magnified. Gulls never ventured this high. Eagles or hawks might skim the treetops, but here there was nothing, as though every creature had fled at the first sign of danger. He paused by a pine trunk that creaked under its snowy burden, scanning the sloping land. Ahead lay a narrow ravine he hadn't noticed before, a sharp cut in the earth, flanked by tall firs. He craned his neck, peering into the gulch. The trees within were close-packed and heavy with snow. No footprints were visible, just a scattering of shattered branches, like something had barged through at some point. It reminded him of the bizarre furrows he'd seen earlier, but at least here, the clutter might make it difficult for anything much larger than him to move freely. He hesitated at the edge of the gully, weighing the risk of burning energy on a dead end. Then came another crack from behind, accompanied by what might have been the hiss of branches collapsing under a heavy weight. That was enough. He had to move. Sliding a few steps down the bank, he tested the footing. The snow was knee-deep, stiff enough on top to hold his weight for half a moment before crumbling. He gripped an overhanging branch for balance. Cold needles brushed his hand, and clumps of snow fell away, pattering his shoulders. He glanced back once more, half expecting to see a lumbering form break the tree line, but nothing materialized. The air felt charged, just like it does before a storm. A flicker of movement drew his eye to a ridge on his right. There, bathed in the lust-bold rays of the setting sun, stood the doe, slender, alert, ears angled forward. She watched him without fear, her coat rimmed in gold against the darkening forest behind. He froze, breath catching, remembering the soft intonation of her voice. She offered no words now, only a slow shake of her head. Even this was almost human in its meaning, as if to say, "Don't." He felt his stomach clench. What choice did he have? Before he could so much as whisper, another thunderous snap ripped through the stillness. The doe flicked her ears, turning her gaze towards the sound. Her posture tensed for an instant. Then she turned and vanished, melting into the deepening shadows above. His heart thudded in protest. He wanted to call out, to follow her somewhere safer, but one more crash sealed his decision. With trembling steps, he descended fully into the ravine. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. Snow began to fall again, thick flakes spiraling down and muffling everything in a white blanket. Even his own footfalls sounded muted. Within minutes, the sky overhead became a mere strip of shifting grey between steep banks cluttered with bent pine trunks. Occasionally the gulch widened enough to admit a shaft of golden light, but it never lasted long. The slope kept leading him forward, so he followed it, half crouched to avoid low-hanging branches. He tried not to think about what might happen if whatever was up there decided to follow him in. The walls seemed almost to lean closer, as though the forest itself had closed ranks. When he stopped to catch his breath, it was the quiet that unsettled him most. His head pounded, and he realized he'd clenched the rifle so hard his hands were aching. He pressed on. Shadows lengthened across the gulch floor, erasing all but the faintest remnants of daylight. His breath emerged in ragged clouds that clung to his face before dissolving. Slowly, he became aware of a subtle change in the air, an unmistakable scent, like damp fur and decay riding the wind. He swallowed hard, wishing he could dismiss it as imagination, but everything in his body screamed that it was real. He tightened his grip on the rifle. A crash shattered the silence, closer than ever, causing him to nearly lose his footing. Something colossal slammed against a nearby tree, with a noise that rattled the branches overhead. He stumbled forward, choking on the knot of fear lodged in his throat. Snow slid from an overburdened limb, showering him in cold powder. He wiped his face, blinking furiously, and forced himself to keep going, one step after another. Panic threatened to flood his senses, but if he gave in to it, he'd be done for. He risked a glance back along the winding corridor. All he saw was a swirl of flakes and half-lit trunks, but the sense of presence was unmistakable, as though the forest had braced for the arrival of some primeval force. He focused on the path ahead, telling himself if he just found a break in the gorge or a slope he could climb, he might still escape. His mind flicked to the deer again. Had she led him here, or was she trying to steer him away from something worse? Dusk settled in earnest, the final scraps of golden light swallowed by the heights above. Snow drifted thicker, bleaching out what little contrast remained. He could scarcely make out the next bend until he was upon it. The gloom pulsed around him, each breath loud in his ears. Then came another thunderous crash, so close he felt it vibrate underfoot. Some part of him wanted to crouch low, cover his head, and pretend he could hide. Instead, he pressed desperately on, forging through the knee-deep drifts. He reached a spot where the gulch widened slightly, offering a fleeting sense of space. He allowed himself a single look upwards. The sky was a dull grey bruise, the underside of the clouds tinted faintly by the last scraps of daylight. Snow fell in clumps. He had the awful feeling that he'd just entered a clearing with nowhere else to run. He heard a final terrible splitting of wood behind him, then silence. In that moment, he realized it was all but dark now. The gloom settled like a shroud, and he could no longer see even a trace of the route he'd taken. The unseen thing that followed him was out there, maybe a few strides away. He tightened his hold on the rifle. The forest yielded no clues, no escape. Beneath the hush of the falling snow, his pulse hammered like a drumbeat. He lifted his gaze, half expecting to glimpse the doe again, but the clearing was empty. His breath came in ragged gasps, each exhalation steaming in the cold. Darkness crept over the gulch walls, turning every shape into a menacing silhouette. He thought he heard the crunch of something heavy moving, but it might have been his own breath echoing. The next crash, if it came, would be on top of him. Swallowing hard, he took a few steps further into the clearing. The day was gone. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows, and whatever lurked behind him had not stopped. He could practically sense it, unhurried and unstoppable. He opened his mouth, but no words formed, only a thin wisp of breath, hanging in the air like smoke, then gone. He moved across the snow-covered plateau, breath ragged. The darkness up here was tempered by a brilliant moon that cast the world in sharp contrasts, black and silver, as though someone had drained away every other hue. The air was so still that the crunch of his boots on the crusted drifts echoed. The plateau opened up, rising slightly before ending in a jagged drop. Just beyond the edge, a vertical curtain of ice clung to the rock, frozen in the shape of motion, a river arrested mid-fall. He paused at its edge, chest heaving, rifle clutched in shaking hands. A faint white mist drifted over the jagged shelf, a fragile ghost of snow swirling in the moonlight. From here, above the trees, the land opened up, ridges and forested slopes rolling out to the horizon. For an instant, he felt almost awed by the sight, by the vastness of the San Juans under a cold moon. But then, a splintering crash shattered his reverie. Trees trembled somewhere behind him, and the ground seemed to hum with the force of something enormous, pushing through the forest. He leaned forward to inspect the sheer face of the waterfall. In daylight, under calmer circumstances, it might have been a spectacular landmark. Now it was simply a deadly drop. The ice glistened in streaks of pale glow, forming jagged curtains that disappeared into a black void below. His stomach turned at the thought of scaling down. One slip, and that would be the end. He turned, heart hammering. Snow encrusted his eyelashes, and his breath clouded the frigid air. The clearing behind him extended only a few dozen paces before the pines took over again. He couldn't see what stalked him, but he felt it. A presence in the darkness, a hidden force. His legs trembled, threatening to give out. Hours of flight had drained him, and now there was nowhere left to run. A low groan reverberated among the trees. He swallowed. This time the sound was closer to a breath than a snapping trunk, an exhalation of pure menace. His pulse pounded in his skull. Slowly, he raised the rifle. His arms felt like they were made of lead, but he forced them steady. He braced himself, searching the gloom for any hint of movement. The pines at the clearing's edge parted with a slow, deliberate motion, limbs quivering under the weight of something impossibly tall. He saw a flash of pallid flesh, half hidden by gnarled fur so matted it seemed to merge with the bark. Then a skull-like visage emerged, elongated and contorted, with hollow sockets that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The thing had no lips to speak of, just jagged teeth rising from decayed gums, dull with frost and old blood. Its limbs were drawn out and crooked, as if put together by memory, not design. It stood at least 12 feet high, maybe more. He let out a shuddering gasp, adrenaline making his vision swim. His mind recoiled from the creature's shape. It was every nightmare of the old legends made hideous flesh. The Wendigo. He'd heard the name whispered, had read tall tales, but never truly believed such a horror might roam these peaks. Its chest rose in a ragged heave, bones protruding beneath skin as grey as old ice, each breath accompanied by a rattling hiss. In a daze of terror, he squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot thundered off the cliff walls, ricocheting across the silent night. A splash of powder erupted from the creature's upper torso, but it scarcely flinched. Instead, it turned its skull-faced head towards him, dark sockets seeming to fix on his shape. Its mouth yawned, revealing a black throat, then closed on a sound that was almost a chuckle, an obscene mimic of laughter, garbled and wet. He stumbled back, nearly losing his footing at the waterfall's edge. The creature advanced, tattered fur trailing like torn banners. With each step, its elongated claws sank into the snow, leaving deep gouges. Icy wind whipped around it, as though even the cold responded to its presence. A stench of decay wafted across the clearing, striking him like a punch in the gut. The rifle trembled in his grip. He tried to work the bolt for another shot, but his fingers were numb and clumsy with fear. The creature halted a few strides away, towering over him in the moonlight. It made no move to close the final distance, only cocked its head in a slow, near-human motion. He glimpsed the twisted contours of its face, eye sockets wide, ringed with dark tissue, teeth far too numerous for its mouth. Chunks of fur and sinew hung from its limbs, the stench overwhelming. Thick drool dripped onto the snow and steamed. Somewhere high above them, a voice echoed through the clearing. Keakwe. The word lingered on the icy air. The hunter jerked his gaze upward, chest tightening with a hope he couldn't explain. There, perched on a narrow ledge above the waterfall, stood the doe, her silhouette lit silver by the moon. She seemed impossibly small compared to the creature's massive frame, yet her voice cut through the air with eerie clarity. "Why waste your hunger on that pale meat," she called, "when you could taste something you once feared?" The creature let out a deep, rattling growl that became an ear-splitting roar. It reverberated through the clearing, shaking the pines. The hunter felt it vibrate in his lungs, a raw challenge that stirred primal terror in his blood. He braced himself, certain the monster would lunge. Instead, it angled its head upwards, focusing on the deer with a murderous intent that made his skin crawl. A crack of bone or tendon sounded as it twisted its torso, more opening in a silent snarl. The deer stood firm on the ledge, high above the clearing. She didn't flinch. Moonlight caught her eyes, sharp, steady, and too aware. She held her ground, not with panic, but with purpose. As terrifying as the creature was, she wasn't running from it. A moment later, it bellowed again, raw hatred flooding the still night. Then, with a terrifying lunge, it launched itself at the cliff wall, limbs contorting to find purchase on the sheer face. The hunter watched, dumbfounded, as the creature scaled the frozen rock like some spider of the tundra, its unnatural limbs gripping cracks and ledges, moving with staggering speed. Within seconds, it had ascended nearly half the height of the gully, its body silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The deer backed away, disappearing from the ledge as the creature reached it. A final roar tore through the dark, echoing across the chasm. Then both shapes vanished from view, leaving only the sound of ice skittering down the cliff. Slowly, the hunter allowed the barrel of his rifle to lower. His knees threatened to buckle. A force of nature had just been lured away by a creature that shouldn't have existed either. The doe had saved him, yet at what cost? He exhaled in a trembling rush, struggling to make sense of it. The cold pressed in from all sides, but for the moment he felt oddly separate from the fear, as though he were dreaming. Across the gorge, the moonlit silhouette of the mountains beckoned, breathtakingly vast. He looked at it with a numb sort of wonder. Perhaps, he thought, in these ancient places, belief held more sway than he'd ever guessed. Here, stories and nightmares walked the land as surely as any living creature. And in that newfound stillness, alone with nothing but the fading echoes of monstrous roars, he understood that he'd witnessed a hidden corner of this world, one he would never speak of lightly again. Morning found him half frozen, staggering under an ashen sky shot with pink. He could scarcely recall the final hours after the creature tore its way up the frozen cliff. His mind felt scoured clean of thought, leaving only the need to keep moving. At some point, he must have circled the ravine, clambering back uphill in fits and starts, until the trees thinned and a narrow road appeared. He followed the cracked asphalt like a lifeline, ignoring the burning protest of his limbs. By the time the dawn fully bloomed, he could see the neon light of a squat petrol station in the distance. His legs wobbled as he entered, eyes stinging from exhaustion and the sudden warmth. A faint bell jangled above the door. The shop was dim and cramped, the shelves crowded with tins and basic provisions. Beyond them stood the counter, and behind it, an older Diné woman with silver hair braided down one shoulder. She watched him without speaking as he approached, taking in every detail with unsettling calm. He realized belatedly that he must have looked a sight, his coat torn, face streaked with sweat and grime, rifle slung across his back. He managed a nod, feeling self-conscious. "Coffee," he said, voice ragged. The single word felt like gravel in his throat. She set an enameled cup under the spout of a battered machine. The pot hissed and spat dark liquid, filling the small space with a faintly burnt aroma. When she slid the cup towards him, her eyes lingered on his trembling hands. "You find what you were after?" she asked quietly. He had no answer. Instead, he fumbled in his coat for money, nearly dropping his wallet. Her expression shifted, a subtle empathy behind her gaze. She leaned on the counter, not quite smiling but conveying a curious gentleness. He finally mustered enough focus to say, I got turned around, ended up somewhere I shouldn't have." She nodded as though she expected that. "Whatever it was," she said, "it wasn't after you. Not really." His breath caught, a flicker of panic coursing through his mind. How could she know? He looked at her, and for a second he saw a reflection in her eyes, bright, steady, and entirely too knowing. His grip tightened around the coffee cup, knuckles pale beneath a layer of grime. She disappeared beneath the counter, rummaging through something. When she emerged, she held a small charm woven of twine and old bone. It looked ancient and fragile, yet oddly precious. "Some things don't belong here," she murmured, smoothing a frayed edge with her thumb. "But they come anyway." He stared at it, not comprehending. She placed it on the counter between them. "Take it," she said. "Might keep you alive if you ever wander back where your boots have no business." He hesitated, glancing from the charm to her face. A quiet intensity shone there, as though she saw more than just the ragged man in front of her. He picked it up carefully, feeling the coarse texture of the twine. It smelled faintly of sage or juniper. A memory stirred, of the times he'd spent in these mountains as a boy, listening to whispered stories of spirits that roamed the high passes. She placed one hand on top of his, her skin surprisingly warm. "Don't come back without it," she said, her tone firm. "Next time you might not be so lucky." He nodded, swallowing hard. The moment felt charged, like standing at the edge of another great chasm. "Thank you," he managed, though he wasn't sure what he was thanking her for. She inclined her head once, and he thought he glimpsed the ghost of a smile. He never did go back to that forest, nor did he lift a rifle for many seasons thereafter. When the urge to hunt returned, he drove himself to a different range, far from the San Juans, far from the frozen ravines and the whispers of old legends. Before leaving, though, he'd always glance at the charm, an unsettling weight in his chest. He never took it with him. He told himself it was best left undisturbed. Still, something in the back of his mind insisted that if he ever did return to those mountains, he'd slip the charm into his pocket. Part of him wanted to see if the deer would appear again, if the old woman might have more to say. But he never did. Nightmares of bones and hunger still haunted him enough, and a man with sense knew when he was beaten.